Hi, I'm James Walker, Senior Editor at Data Center Knowledge, coming to you live from the news desk, Data Center World 2025 in Washington, D.C. I'm here with Alan Howard, Principal Analyst at Omdia's Cloud and Data Center Research Practice. Alan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, James. A pleasure to be here.
I had the chance to sit in on the Omdia Analyst Summit earlier this week, and some of the numbers are truly staggering. Your team's forecasting that the data center industry could reach a $1 trillion valuation by 2030. But at the same time, we've seen hyperscalers like Microsoft pause or slow down certain construction projects. And this sparked some talk of a potential AI bubble. What's your view? Are we seeing a short-term correction or signs of overreach in the industry?
It's a broad subject. So let me just start by saying that, the $1 trillion is technically our forecast on what CapEx spend will be in 2030. And, the forecasting of this kind of stuff is really interesting work. We have a team that works together. We break down the numbers that come in from the major, server manufacturers. We're looking at all kinds of industry dynamics and trends above and beyond that. So, we have the debate internally about, how realistic is this?
Yeah.
And, we keep coming back to the same answer. And it's not that it's not impossible for some big change in market dynamics to drive that in one direction or the other. But from our perspective at this point in time, knowing what we know, it's pretty solid. Now, in terms of there being, a bubble, there could be numerous different kinds of bubbles, but I think primarily what we're referring to is, essentially an AI bubble of some sort. So in terms of the technology and its trajectory, that seems to be on a solid footing now, notwithstanding any other unforeseen market dynamics. And those can happen, COVID, for example, and so on and so forth. But speaking specifically, to the news about Microsoft and they're cutting back on what they're doing, one of the things that the market gets a little bit antsy about, if you will, is the notion that, this is a big sign that all of a sudden people are going to be cutting back on everything that they're doing. But that market dynamic itself, just specifically to Microsoft, is highly driven by their evolving relationship with OpenAI, right? So Microsoft had the option of moving forward with OpenAI on certain infrastructure deals or not, and they chose not to. But what happened was that demand has shifted over to other companies other than Microsoft themselves. So on the one hand, the overall impact on the industry is not a net negative. Right? It's just net as of this point in time. And then for Microsoft in particular, pardon me if I'm going on kind of long about this, but
No.
Microsoft, Amazon, and Google in particular have been dealing with their infrastructure capacity for long enough that they're way ahead of the game. So that means a lot of land banking, right? Speculative land banking. And a lot of those deals just never really either come together for, they just don't need the capacity in that place. All of a sudden there's a bottleneck in the availability of power, whatever the case may be. And so, the other news that we see about deals being stopped or whatever is not out of the ordinary for that sector of the market that has been buying land and, in droves as a matter of land banking. So that's kind of par for the course. And the thing is that land is cheap. It's an easy way to hedge what I might need, somewhere in the future.
Right. So. Okay, great. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about AI and how it pertains to the actual data center facilities themselves. There's been a lot of talk recently about these so-called AI factories, not just in the tech media, but I've also now seen it in the mainstream press. And what's your take on this term? Are we really headed towards data centers filled with end-to-end AI accelerators, or is this more of a marketing label than a technical reality?
So, good Lord, in a lot of cases, It is sort of marketing hype. So there's a lot of companies outside of the hyperscalers that are opening up data centers and say this is an AI data center. But to your point, data centers with end-to-end AI hardware from NVIDIA or whatever are few and far between. And those data center companies that say, oh, we're building and opening an AI data center so that they can lease out the space, essentially what they're saying is that we can handle AI gear. The probability that the whole thing will fill up with AI gear is very low, right? Yeah. So there are some. And so, the Tesla XAI data center in Memphis, Microsoft project in Wisconsin are going to be, they're designed to handle that kind of load. Now, will every square foot be consumed by that kind of hardware with that kind of power demand? Not likely, but they're as close as we're going to come to these so-called AI factories, right?
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good. Well, likewise, I mean, even the term hyperscaler itself, I know you've long encouraged a more precise use of the term, and I guess this again touches on the kind of the marketing aspects. These days, a lot of data center companies claim to be hyperscalers or hyperscale ready.
Yeah.
How would you define what a true hyperscaler is, and has that definition evolved over time?
Well, it definitely has. And so, I mean, first of all, the term itself it's open for anybody to use any way they want, right? It's like saying tier one markets. Anybody can define that. There's no industry standards or whatever. So in our world, hyperscalers are just limited to Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean other people don't consider other companies hyperscale, but the reason we went that way is that if you were to look at the amount of capital expenditures those four companies have each year, it eclipses the rest of the market.
Right.
So if I look at all companies that are spending over $10 billion a year in data center CapEx specifically, and keep in mind, when we look at a company like Amazon, for example, they've got an enormous retail business.
Yep.
So we're taking that total amount of CapEx that Amazon might spend and figuring out, boiling it down to what they're just spending on data centers.
Okay.
Anyways, the point is Amazon, Google, and Meta, and Microsoft so far eclipse all the other companies. At the next biggest company in terms of 2025 CapEx is around 10 billion compared to anywhere from 45 to 75 billion for those four hyperscalers.
Wow. So there's a long tail leading off from that. Yeah.
Tremendous.
And then I know Omdia and yourself in particular, you do extensive work tracking global data center development growth. Which emerging markets, either globally or maybe secondary US regions, are you most closely paying attention to now?
So, I mean, first of all, the United States is still the epicenter of where the majority of growth is, right? And in the United States, it's a combination of driven by the colo companies as well as the hyperscalers, right? So first of all, think about what we would refer to as all the tier 2 cloud companies, Oracle, IBM, Salesforce, SAP, companies like that. They're not building data centers.
Okay.
Some make it sound like they're building data centers. What they're doing is they're leasing space and then building out the inside, in somebody else's data center. So that's the first thing, is that the majority of building is still here in the United States. On top of that, a lot of the data centers that are being built by the hyperscalers, including Meta, are in areas that are so much more amenable to data centers and have better economics. So Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, a lot of Midwestern states and the Southeast. Those two areas seem to be drawing more of the hyperscale data centers that aren't necessarily dedicated to regions and zones for cloud services. In other words, there's a tremendous amount of compute that goes on for AI and all the other tasks that they do that go into those areas.
Okay.
Now, thinking of AI in particular and where that's going, we're expecting for there to be a lot more activity in Europe.
Okay.
Over 25 and 26, so some of that activity that's sort of based here in the United States right now will be evolving. I won't get too deep into this, but if you think about the demand for heavy-duty AI hardware, primarily that's been going to the United States. And so as, the supply chain continues to expand and make that hardware available to other companies, we'll see a lot going to Europe. Now, obviously, Asia is also a big player. They're a little bit trickier to keep track of between some of the trade restrictions with regard to various kinds of hardware. And the majority of that is based in China. So we think about Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, those kinds of companies. And that's just a little bit more of a challenge to really understand exactly what's going on there. So it is a big market. I wish I could characterize it in definitive terms.
Sure.
But we don't really get that luxury.
Okay. Well, here at Data Center World 2025, it does seem that all roads lead to AI. Well, I was just wondering if, besides AI, what data center technologies are you most enthusiastic about in this year? Is there anything that's going under the radar?
This isn't really new, but the whole notion of using prefabricated modular components in data center construction, right?
Okay, yeah.
And so that's been evolving for quite some time. And in our research, it's easy to see that power modules are the most popular, right? So there's other types, but that's really where the market is focused. And what's kind of interesting is that what makes prefabricated power modules appealing, of course, is their standardization, their quality control, they're pre-commissioned before they're delivered on site. And when COVID happened, one of the things that became clear right away was that it's very difficult to get people on site, during COVID. They had to be managed in a way to not spread, make the pandemic worse, right?
Right.
And so they gained a lot of popularity there just for that reason. But the other thing we're seeing right now is a big challenge in terms of electricians.
Okay.
So if I stick build a data center and use traditional methods, right? So I want to put in my power distribution infrastructure, a specific way to meet my needs. And so I don't go with prefab modular, but that requires a lot more skilled labor, and particularly electricians, and there is a shortage. Right?
Okay.
So those are all the things that make using prefabricated modular technologies so good. But there's two primary obstacles to that. One is just traditional builders, right?
Okay.
We've always done it this way before. We can trust our electricians and we'll just keep doing it that way. So that's one thing. It's just it's just a lack of, insight with regard to how to improve efficiency. The second one is you can't always get what you want where you need it.
Right. Okay.
Right. So different kinds of data center builders have different timelines. In the co-location world, it's often accelerated, right? So the land has been acquired, the entitlements have already been put in place. All we need is for that demand threshold to be met, and then we're going to put shovels in the ground to build our next expansion.
Yep.
And so sometimes that can happen quickly, and therefore prefab modular is less of a good option because maybe I'm building in Belgium and yet my suppliers in the United States or wherever they might be coming from, and that just makes it a real challenge. So timing is a real challenge. And if you talk to data center operators and builders, they will tell you that once we start a construction project, time is everything.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to sacrifice it to wait on something else. I'll make one other comment about this, and that is that it's very difficult for people to get their arms around how complex a construction project is. So construction projects are complex no matter what, but when you add in the amount of infrastructure and the amount of redundancy that goes into data centers, it's a whole different ballgame. It's very, very complex.
Okay, fantastic. Alan, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights. It'll be interesting to keep a close eye on, see how these trends unfold. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thanks.